The road to redemption. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the serenity of the quiet night, casting sharp, angular reflections on the rain-slicked road as Naomi Carter's sleek black Mercedes rolled to a stop. Her hands remained firm on the steering wheel, steady and unshaken. Her gaze was focused on the rearview mirror as she silently assessed the situation. In the distance, the silhouette of the police cruiser grew larger, its headlights cutting through the mist. The tires hummed against the asphalt, rhythmic and calm, like the beat of her heart. The peace of the night was shattered by the steady approach of the officers. Naomi Carter was used to being underestimated. She built an empire on being underestimated. But tonight, things were different. She knew what was about to unfold on this stretch of highway, one that was all too familiar to her. And it had the potential to reveal just how deeply ingrained prejudice could be, even in the eyes of the law. It was 11:47 p.m. The streets of Birmingham, Alabama, had emptied of most of its residents long ago. The city was quiet except for the occasional sound of an engine passing by or the soft whistle of wind through the trees. But the moment Naomi had turned onto this deserted road, she had felt it. The twinge in her stomach, that familiar sensation of being watched, of not quite belonging. Not because she wasn't from here, this was her home, but because, to some, no matter how far she had come, she was still that black woman in a luxury car, driving through the wrong neighborhood. And tonight, that stereotype would collide headfirst with the woman she had become. Naomi exhaled sharply, then lowered her hand onto the passenger seat, where her purse rested. She felt the edges of the small black box that contained the one thing that had changed her life forever. The key to a billion-dollar business empire. But even with her success, even with the wealth and status she had built from the ground up, she knew that none of it mattered tonight, not when the game was rigged from the start. The police car came to a halt behind her, and the sound of the engine died down as the officer exited the vehicle. Naomi watched as the officer, tall, with dark sunglasses that seemed out of place for the hour, approached her car. His stride was stiff, measured. She could see the air of authority he carried with him, the confidence that came from a uniform, from power. But Naomi didn't flinch. She had been through worse. She had faced more dangerous battles than this, and tonight, she would fight this one with the same grace and resolve she had faced every obstacle in her life. The officer stopped by her window and motioned for her to roll it down. Naomi complied, keeping her movements slow, deliberate. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat, almost dismissive. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Naomi studied his face carefully, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned her car with an almost clinical detachment. It wasn't the first time she had been pulled over under suspicious circumstances. It wasn't even the first time a police officer had looked at her as though she didn't belong in the vehicle she was driving. And it definitely wasn't the first time she had been judged for being a successful black woman. "No, officer. I don't," Naomi replied calmly, her voice smooth and even. He hesitated, his gaze now flickering over her with a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "You're driving through a known high-crime area, ma'am," he said, his tone barely concealing his judgment. "I need to see your ID and registration." Naomi's eyes narrowed. She had lived in this neighborhood her entire life. She knew the history of this area, its people, its struggles. She knew how the city had been shaped by economic decline, racial inequality, and years of injustice. But Naomi also knew that this street, where her father had taught her how to ride a bike, where she had spent countless summer nights with her brother on the front porch, was more than just a high-crime area to her. It was home. Slowly, she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out her registration and insurance, handing them over to the officer. He took them with an air of condescension, flipping through the documents as if he were doing her a favor. His eyes lingered on the name Naomi Carter printed on the registration, and for a brief moment, Naomi saw the flicker of something in his expression, something like surprise, maybe even suspicion. "And where are you headed?" he asked, voice suddenly colder. "I'm just on my way home." Naomi replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I live nearby." The officer nodded, but Naomi could tell he wasn't listening. His mind was already working, processing information, fitting her into the box he had mentally prepared for her. A box marked with assumptions, prejudice, and a lack of imagination. It was something she had faced her entire life, but it always stung. Even now, with everything she had achieved, she could feel the weight of that invisible barrier, the one that society often placed around black women who dared to break the mold. She watched as the officer stepped back from her window and moved toward his cruiser. Her mind raced, but her body remained still, calm. She thought about how far she had come from those early days in Birmingham. She thought about her parents, who had worked tirelessly to give her the best shot at success, despite the odds stacked against them. She thought about the dreams she had, dreams that had once seemed impossible, and how she had turned them into reality. And now, in the face of this moment, in the face of this officer who couldn't even fathom the life she had built, Naomi knew she had one more test to pass. As the officer radioed something into his car, Naomi's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't just going to sit here and take it. She wasn't going to let this moment be defined by the color of her skin, by the car she drove, or by the assumptions made about her based on nothing more than her appearance. The officer returned a few minutes later, his expression unreadable. "All right, Ms. Carter," he said, his tone now more businesslike, but still clipped. "I'm letting you go with a warning. Just make sure you stay in your lane next time." Naomi nodded politely, taking the papers he handed her. But just as she was about to start her engine, she noticed something. The officer's posture had changed. There was something in the way he looked at her now, a mixture of wariness and perhaps a grudging respect. Before he turned to leave, Naomi spoke. "Officer, I hope you understand that there's more to people than what they drive or where they come from. My name means something, and I've worked hard to build what I have. I don't deserve to be treated like I don't belong here." The officer paused, his back still turned to her, and for a brief moment, the night felt still. Then he nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. As Naomi pulled away, the lights from the police car faded in her rearview mirror. Her heart still pounded in her chest, but there was a sense of resolve building within her. Tonight was a small victory, one of many she had fought for, one of many that had yet to come. But Naomi Carter knew that this moment, this night, wasn't just about her getting away unscathed. It was about something bigger. It was about showing the world that she, too, belonged. That she, too, had a voice that could not be silenced. And that was just the beginning. The unseen battles. The Mercedes hummed steadily as Naomi drove away, her knuckles still white against the steering wheel. As the police cruiser's flashing lights receded in her rearview mirror, a slight tension still lingered in her chest. It wasn't the first time she had been pulled over or harassed by law enforcement, but something about tonight's encounter felt different. The officer's words, though polite, left a bitter taste in her mouth. A warning, as if she needed reminding of her place. As the city of Birmingham unfolded before her, Naomi couldn't help but reflect on the long road she had traveled. It was an intimate journey, one that ran deep in the veins of this town, woven through with history, hardship, and an unshakable belief that one day she would prove that the world could never define her based on the color of her skin or the car she drove. She was so much more than that. But even now, as a successful entrepreneur, as the founder of a multi-million-dollar tech firm that was about to hit its billion-dollar valuation, Naomi still found herself fighting battles that no one could see. Tonight was just one more chapter in a life full of contradictions, success that carried an invisible weight, visibility that made her an object of scrutiny. She had become used to the whispers in boardrooms, the sideways glances at fancy galas, the polite but patronizing smiles. Yet she also knew that every challenge, every slight, was a part of her story, an integral piece of the puzzle that was her resilience. She parked her car in the driveway of a stately, modern home tucked in one of the nicer neighborhoods of Birmingham. It was a far cry from the small, modest house where she had grown up, where her parents had sacrificed so much to ensure she had a chance at a better life. Naomi stepped out of the car, the cool night air wrapping around her. She looked at the sprawling lawn and the gleaming windows of her home, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had built. But even in this moment of accomplishment, she knew the price she had paid. She had worked herself to the bone, poured every ounce of energy into her business, taken risks that most would consider foolish. But all of it had led her here, to a place where the world seemed to view her as nothing more than a symbol of success, and not a person with her own unique story, struggles, and dreams. She walked to the front door and stopped for a moment, staring at the polished brass knocker. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the memories of sitting at the kitchen table with her parents, doing homework under the harsh glow of a flickering light. Her father's calloused hands working long hours at the steel mill, the rhythmic sound of his boots hitting the porch step as he came home exhausted each night. Her mother, always on her feet, making ends meet by running the school cafeteria, greeting every student with a smile, even when they hadn't been given much to smile about. Her parents had instilled in her a sense of responsibility, a deep, unwavering sense of duty to fight for a better life. But they had also taught her something else, something even more powerful, the importance of integrity. Her father had always said, "You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room, Naomi, but you have to be the most consistent." He meant that in everything, not just work, but in character. Naomi had spent her entire life proving that consistency, showing up every day, no matter how hard it got, was the only way forward. But tonight, something inside her felt unsettled, as though a new chapter was beginning, one she wasn't quite prepared for. Naomi had been on the fast track to success long before she built her billion-dollar company. In fact, it had all started years ago with a simple but powerful idea. Technology could change the world. Growing up, Naomi had always been the one to tinker with gadgets, to take apart electronics and put them back together. She'd seen how technology had shaped the world around her, how it created new opportunities for people who had never before been given the chance to succeed. And so, at 21, she'd enrolled in a tech school, despite the doubts of those who told her she wouldn't last. "I think you'd be better off trying something more traditional," one of her high school teachers had suggested. "A business degree, maybe, or something with a more predictable future." But Naomi wasn't one to follow easy paths. She'd pursued technology with a fierce determination, believing that she could bridge the gap between Silicon Valley and the communities that needed the help most. Communities like the one she had grown up in. Naomi knew firsthand how access to technology could level the playing field, how it could open doors that had always been locked. She had dropped out of college after her sophomore year, convinced she could make her mark without the traditional route. She used her savings, scraped together from odd jobs and freelance work, to build a rudimentary website for small businesses in her area. It was nothing fancy, just a clean, easy-to-navigate platform for local shops and restaurants to promote themselves online. But what she lacked in resources, she'd more than made up for in vision and drive. At the time, her friends and family had thought she was crazy. Everyone was telling her to get a real job, that the dream of starting her own company was far-fetched. But Naomi believed in herself. She knew that what she had to offer was worth more than anyone could see. Her breakthrough came when she was 26. After years of hustling, pitching to investors, and facing rejection after rejection, Naomi had managed to secure her first major deal. A partnership with a prominent venture capital firm that saw potential in her approach to technology. The deal allowed her to hire a team, build a product, and expand her reach. What began as a small side project had evolved into Carter Innovations, a tech company focused on bridging the digital divide and helping small businesses in underserved communities access the tools they needed to grow and thrive. It wasn't long before she caught the eye of major players in the tech industry. By the time she turned 30, she had secured enough funding to take Carter Innovations to a global stage. Her company now developed cutting-edge technology for healthcare, education, and finance, empowering those who had long been left behind by traditional industries. Yet, despite her meteoric rise, Naomi knew she was seen by many as an anomaly. As a black woman in tech, she was constantly reminded that she didn't quite fit the mold. The tech world was still predominantly white and male, and Naomi often felt the sting of being the only woman, the only person of color, in the room. But she never let it stop her. Instead, she worked harder, smarter, and more passionately than anyone else. Every challenge she faced was a reminder of how far she had come, and how far she still had to go. Back in her home, Naomi walked through the foyer and into her living room. Her eyes fell on a framed photo of her parents, a snapshot from the summer of her graduation, when they had beamed with pride, even though they'd never fully understood what she did. "You just make sure to do right by people, Naomi," her father had said that day. "That's all that matters." She smiled, remembering his words. Doing right by people. It was a simple philosophy, but one that had carried her through the darkest times. And as she sank into the leather armchair by the fireplace, Naomi made a vow to herself. She would keep fighting. She would keep proving that she belonged, that her identity was more than just a narrative of hardship or prejudice. And that when the time came, she would make sure that the world saw her for who she truly was, not just the black woman who had defied the odds, but the woman who had changed the game entirely. The silent war. The night was quieter than usual when Naomi woke the next morning, the soft hum of her home's automated systems greeting her as the sun began to peek through the curtains. For a moment, she lay still in bed, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening. The tension of the traffic stop, the officer's condescending tone, the look of disbelief in his eyes when he saw her name on the registration. She had expected the encounter to leave a mark, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply it would settle in her chest. Yet, despite the unease, Naomi had learned long ago that self-doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. Success in her world wasn't a result of talent alone. It was the product of grit, resilience, and the ability to rise above the noise of those who tried to define her. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about proving that she, as a black woman, could exist in spaces where she wasn't always welcome. And excel, not just survive. She rose from the bed and stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. A woman with sharp features and a gaze that was both kind and unyielding. Her black hair framed her face in its natural curl, a symbol of the confidence she had come to embrace, a quiet defiance of the world's beauty standards. And yet, every day, it felt like she was battling an invisible enemy, one that sought to undermine her success with every glance, every comment, every assumption. This battle, this silent war, wasn't new to Naomi. It had begun when she was just a girl, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, a city that was still haunted by the ghosts of racial inequality, by old prejudices that clung to its streets like the summer humidity. Naomi knew the way people saw her before they saw the person she was. They saw her as a black woman, and for many, that was enough to dictate her worth. She had been overlooked, dismissed, and patronized far more times than she cared to count. But she had never let it stop her. She had learned how to turn their assumptions into fuel, to turn the closed doors into an invitation to kick them down. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus, her lead investor and longtime mentor. "Good morning, Naomi. I've been thinking about the pitch meeting we have next week. I know it's going to be a game changer for Carter Innovations. But remember, the industry is still holding on to some old biases. They may not show it on the surface, but we both know they're there. Just don't let it shake you. You've already broken the mold. Keep pushing forward." Naomi read the message twice. Marcus had always been supportive, his belief in her unwavering. But there was something in his words that struck a chord. They may not show it on the surface, but we both know they're there. The biases, the assumptions, the stereotypes, they were always lurking, waiting to rear their ugly head when she least expected it. Naomi had become so accustomed to them that they barely registered anymore. At least, not until moments like last night, when she was reminded just how easily the world could revert to seeing her as nothing more than a product of her skin color rather than her accomplishments. She put the phone down and made her way to the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. As she poured herself a cup, her mind drifted back to the early days of Carter Innovations, when she had been the only one who believed in her idea. The journey had been lonely, filled with doubts, skepticism, and endless nights of self-reliance. But it was also a journey that had led to this moment, one that had proven that, against all odds, she could do it. She could succeed in an industry that was hostile to anyone who didn't fit the mold. But what about now? Now that she had made it to the top, was the war truly over, or was it just changing its tactics? She knew that the tech world, despite its public commitment to diversity and inclusion, was still largely dominated by white men, especially in the venture capital world. Every time Naomi walked into a room for a pitch meeting, she was aware of the subtle, almost imperceptible differences in the way she was treated compared to her peers. The first few minutes of conversation were always the same: polite smiles, handshakes, and the faintly patronizing tone that said, "Let's see if you really belong here." And once she got to talking, once she started breaking down the numbers, explaining her vision, and articulating how Carter Innovations was changing the game, she could see the surprise in their eyes. Surprise that a young black woman from Birmingham, Alabama, had built something so impactful, so scalable. But the surprise wasn't always a compliment. Sometimes it was a challenge. Sometimes it felt like an invitation to prove herself again, and again, and again. "Don't let it shake you." Marcus's words echoed in her mind. Naomi smiled to herself. She couldn't afford to let it shake her. Not now. Not when her company was about to hit $1 billion valuation. Not when her work was changing the lives of underserved communities. Not when she knew that there was still so much to be done. She had spent her whole life learning to navigate the world on her terms. She wasn't going to let anyone, least of all some officer who presumed to know her place in the world, make her feel small again. That afternoon, Naomi's phone rang. It was a blocked number. She hesitated for a moment, but something told her to pick up. "Naomi Carter?" a gruff voice asked. "Yes, this is she." "This is Detective Roberts with the Birmingham Police Department. I need to speak with you about an incident that occurred last night." Her heart skipped a beat. The traffic stop. She had expected some follow-up, but she wasn't sure what this was about. "What about it?" "The officer who pulled you over, Officer Finch. He's filing a report about the incident. There were concerns raised, specifically about your attitude during the stop." His tone was even, almost clinical. Naomi's mind raced. My attitude. She had been calm, collected. She hadn't said anything out of line. What was he talking about? "I see," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "And what exactly are the concerns?" "Apparently, Officer Finch felt that you were uncooperative, and there was some resistance when he asked for your identification." Naomi paused, taking a deep breath. "I wasn't uncooperative. I complied with every request. I gave him my registration, insurance, and ID. What else does he want from me?" The detective was silent for a moment. "Look, Miss Carter, this isn't about you specifically, but it's standard procedure for us to look into these things. There's no need for you to worry, but I just wanted to make you aware." Naomi's blood began to boil, but she kept her composure. "I understand. Thank you for informing me." She hung up the phone, her mind whirling. Uncooperative. She had been nothing but polite. But now it was clear that what had been a simple, routine traffic stop for her had been turned into something else entirely. Something that reeked of a larger agenda, one that sought to discredit her, to put her back in her place. But Naomi knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let them control her narrative. They could try to paint her as a difficult black woman, the kind who didn't know her place. They could try to tear her down, undermine her success, and hold her to a standard they never held others to. But Naomi had fought too hard to let that happen. This was only the beginning. The real war, one fought not on the streets but in the hearts and minds of those who tried to keep her down, was only just getting started. And Naomi Carter wasn't about to lose it. Not now. Not ever. The weight of expectation. The following days after the police encounter felt like a haze. Naomi kept moving, kept working, but something inside her had shifted. The calm, composed woman who had faced down adversity with a quiet but unshakable confidence was now grappling with something more insidious. The weight of expectation. It wasn't just about success anymore. It was about proving her humanity, defending her very right to occupy spaces where she was continually made to feel unwelcome. She was no longer just the founder of Carter Innovations, a rising star in the tech industry. She was a symbol of resistance, a defiant challenge to the way the world had always seen black women in power. Her mornings were filled with board meetings, presentations, and strategy sessions as her company approached the final stages of securing the funding needed to push Carter Innovations to the next level. They were on the brink of a billion-dollar valuation. But every email, every phone call, every conversation felt somehow heavier than it used to. The subtle microaggressions, the questions about her legitimacy, the insinuations that she only succeeded because of her race or worse, her gender, had always been there, hovering at the edge of her professional life. But now, they seemed louder, more insistent, as if everyone in the room was trying to find a reason why she didn't deserve to be there. That morning, as she sat in her office overlooking the city, reviewing the quarterly projections with her team, the door opened with a soft knock. Naomi looked up to see her chief of operations, Sasha, standing in the doorway. "Hey, Naomi, got a minute?" Sasha asked, her voice laced with concern. "Of course," Naomi said, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "What's on your mind?" Sasha sat down, folding her arms. Naomi noticed the furrow in her brow, the tension in her shoulders. "I just wanted to check in with you," Sasha began. "You've been off lately. And I don't know if it's just the pressure of everything with the funding round, or if it's something else, but I can tell something's bothering you." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. She had always admired Sasha's intuition. The woman could read her better than anyone else, and Naomi knew that keeping her guard up around Sasha was almost impossible. "You're right," Naomi said softly, letting out a breath. "It's been a lot. The funding is great, don't get me wrong. But everything else, it's heavy." Sasha raised an eyebrow, her gaze searching Naomi's face. "What do you mean by everything else?" Naomi hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to express the frustration that had been building up in her chest. "It's the constant battle," she said finally, "not just with the business, but with the way people perceive me. The way they try to put me in a box. Last night, after the police stop, I thought maybe I'd just let it go. But it's not just that. It's everything. The expectations, the judgments, the assumptions. It feels like no matter how much I achieve, I'll always be fighting to prove I belong." Sasha's expression softened, and she reached across the desk, placing a hand on Naomi's. "I get it," she said quietly. "The world has a way of treating women like us as if we're always too much, too loud, too ambitious, too out of place. But Naomi, you've already proven them wrong. Look at what you've built. You've built a billion-dollar company from scratch. That's no small feat. They can't take that from you." Naomi's lips twisted into a wry smile. "But they still try, don't they?" Sasha gave a small laugh. "Every day. But you don't let them win." It was true. Naomi didn't let them win. She had never let anyone dictate her narrative. Not the teachers who doubted her as a girl, not the investors who thought she was just another black woman trying to get a seat at the table, not the colleagues who had assumed she'd never make it in the tech world. She had fought for every inch of her success, and she wasn't going to let anyone rewrite her story now. But that didn't mean the weight didn't take a toll. As the days wore on, Naomi became more attuned to the subtle ways people tried to undermine her. In meetings with potential investors, she noticed the flicker of skepticism in their eyes when she presented her vision. There were the lingering questions about the legitimacy of her success, questions that never seemed to come up when a white man was in her position. "How did you make this all happen, Naomi?" they would ask, as if her success was some kind of miracle, a fluke. But it wasn't a fluke. Naomi had worked harder than most. She had pushed herself to the brink, sacrificing everything: her personal life, her health, her sense of peace, just to get to this point. And now, after everything she had been through, she still had to face the question: did she really deserve to be here? One evening, Naomi stood in front of a room full of high-profile investors, preparing to present her company's vision for the future. The tension in the room was palpable. She had done this hundreds of times before, pitching her business, answering questions, deflecting skepticism. But tonight, something felt different. The investors were attentive, their eyes fixed on her, some nodding along as she spoke about the innovative ways Carter Innovations was changing the landscape of small business support. But Naomi couldn't help but notice the way one of the men, Thomas Harding, a well-known venture capitalist who had made millions backing tech startups, kept glancing at his watch. Every time she made a compelling point, he shifted in his seat, as though he were waiting for the presentation to be over. After Naomi finished her pitch, there was a brief silence in the room before Thomas cleared his throat. "Very impressive, Naomi," he said, his voice smooth, almost condescending. "But tell me, how does a company like yours plan to survive the economic downturn? What makes you so sure that the market will be receptive to this kind of innovation?" Naomi held his gaze, resisting the urge to respond with the edge that threatened to rise in her chest. She had heard these kinds of questions before. They were never about the business. They were about her credibility, about her ability to lead. "I'm confident in the trajectory of our business because we're not just building a product, we're building a movement," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "We've been working closely with underserved communities for years, and we've seen firsthand how access to technology has transformed their ability to grow and succeed. In fact, the downturn has created a greater need for what we offer. Small businesses, especially those in marginalized communities, are struggling more than ever to adapt. They need innovative solutions now more than ever." Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, as if waiting for the other investors to weigh in. Naomi's eyes flickered briefly to the others. She could see the subtle shifts in their expressions, the faint looks of doubt. They hadn't heard her. Not really. She stood up straighter, her eyes fixed on Thomas. "I'm not asking for your approval, Mr. Harding," she said, her voice firm. "I'm simply telling you what's real. Our growth isn't about predictions or projections. It's about the impact we've already made. And if you're not ready to see that, then maybe this conversation isn't for you." There was a moment of stunned silence before one of the other investors, a woman named Karen, spoke up. "Naomi's right. The market is changing, and companies like Carter Innovations are the future. We've already seen how their solutions are making a tangible difference. Let's not ignore the obvious here." Naomi felt a surge of relief, but it was fleeting. She had won this round, but she knew the battle wasn't over. The world still wasn't ready to embrace a woman like her in the way she deserved. She had proven herself in the boardroom, in the tech world, and with every investor who had doubted her. But there was always something more, always the pressure to go further, do more, be more. She left the meeting room that night feeling the weight of it all, her shoulders aching with the invisible burden she carried. She had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. She would continue to break down doors, continue to defy expectations, but with each victory, she couldn't help but wonder, when would the world finally see me for who I really am? For now, Naomi Carter would keep pushing forward, because in the end, she knew that the weight of expectation, while heavy, would never crush her spirit. She had fought too long and come too far to let anything stop her now. a crack in the armor. Naomi had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed, to keep her emotions in check, especially when facing challenges. She trained herself to compartmentalize work, family, personal life, all neatly boxed away, separate from one another. But recently, the cracks were starting to show. They weren't huge, but Naomi felt them. Tiny fissures in the armor she had so carefully constructed over the years. It wasn't just the police encounter. It wasn't just the way the investors doubted her, or the condescending remarks she endured from colleagues who couldn't seem to see past her skin and gender. It was the relentless pressure to be perfect, to perform at an impossible level. It was the weight of expectation, the constant reminder that she wasn't just Naomi Carter, the CEO of Carter Innovations. She was a symbol, a beacon of hope, yes, but also a target. She'd always believed that if she could keep her head down, if she could just keep working hard and proving her worth, then eventually the world would catch up. Eventually, people would stop seeing her as an anomaly and start seeing her for the formidable businesswoman she truly was. But no matter how much success she achieved, it felt like there was always a layer of doubt just beneath the surface, about her legitimacy, her authority, her place in the world. That evening, Naomi sat in her office, looking out over the city skyline. The lights of Birmingham flickered in the distance, a sea of possibilities, both exciting and overwhelming. She had just finished another round of meetings, and her mind was buzzing with numbers, strategies, and projections. But despite the forward momentum, there was a nagging sense of fatigue creeping into her bones. She had been working nonstop for weeks, her calendar packed with back-to-back calls, meetings, and events. "Hey, Naomi, you still here?" came a voice from the doorway. Naomi turned to see Sasha leaning against the frame, arms crossed. She had a concerned look on her face, but there was also something else, something like understanding, a shared knowledge that Naomi couldn't quite escape. "I'm finishing up some numbers," Naomi replied, trying to sound more upbeat than she felt. "But I'll be out in a minute." Sasha didn't budge. "I know you're working hard, but you're burning yourself out. I see it. You've been pushing yourself too much lately. And the thing is, you don't have to do it all alone, Naomi. You have a team here. Let us help you. You're carrying so much on your shoulders, and you don't have to carry it all by yourself." Naomi bit her lip, trying to suppress the overwhelming tide of emotions that suddenly threatened to rise. She had always been the one who held it together, the one who handled everything, her business, her employees, her image. It was easier that way. Easier to be the strong one. Easier to maintain the illusion of perfection. But right now, Naomi felt far from perfect. "I'm fine, Sasha," Naomi said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot going on. You know how it is." Sasha stepped into the room, her gaze soft but insistent. "I know you, Naomi. And I know when something's bothering you. This isn't just about the company. This is about everything. The weight you've been carrying for so long. You've fought so hard to get where you are, but even you have limits. You're only human." Naomi's throat tightened. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had spent so long trying to prove that she wasn't just another token success story, that she could handle everything without needing help. And now, in the face of Sasha's kindness, Naomi felt a deep sense of vulnerability that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I don't know how to stop, Sasha," Naomi admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to stop fighting. How to stop pushing." Sasha sat down beside her, offering her a quiet presence that Naomi hadn't realized she needed so desperately. "You don't have to stop fighting, but you do need to take a breath. You've been in survival mode for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to just live, to breathe. You've been carrying the weight of the world for so long, Naomi, you've forgotten that you're allowed to be human. You're allowed to feel tired. You're allowed to not have all the answers." Naomi's eyes blurred with tears. She quickly blinked them away, not wanting to seem weak, but it was too late. The floodgates had opened. For the first time in years, Naomi let herself feel the exhaustion, the strain, the rawness of everything she had fought for, and the toll it had taken on her. Sasha didn't say anything, but her hand was warm on Naomi's shoulder, her presence a steady anchor. For a long while, they sat there in silence, the only sound the quiet hum of the office's lights and the distant rush of traffic. The following week, Naomi did something she hadn't done in years. She took a break. She had no meetings, no calls, no presentations, just a day to herself to recharge. She spent the morning at a local cafe, sitting by the window, sipping on a latte as the world passed by. It was strange to be still, to not have a million things on her to-do list. But it felt right. It felt necessary. As she sat there, lost in thought, Naomi's phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "I know you're pushing hard right now, but don't forget to take care of yourself. The world is full of distractions, and it's easy to get lost in the grind. Don't forget why you started this journey in the first place. Stay grounded." She smiled at the message, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her. Marcus had been a constant in her life, a mentor who had always encouraged her to stay true to herself. His words reminded her of something she had almost forgotten, why she had started all of this in the first place. It wasn't just about proving herself to the world, or even about building a billion-dollar company. It was about creating something that made a difference. It was about showing that people like her, people who didn't fit the mold, could still rise to the top. But somewhere along the way, in the rush to succeed, she had lost sight of that. She had been so focused on the fight that she had forgotten the joy, the purpose behind it all. She had been so caught up in breaking down walls and defying expectations that she had forgotten to stop and appreciate how far she had come. She finished her latte and stepped outside, the sun warming her face. For the first time in a long while, Naomi felt the weight of the world lift, just for a moment. She wasn't just Naomi Carter, the woman who had fought to succeed against impossible odds. She was Naomi Carter, a woman who had worked tirelessly to create something meaningful, something that could change lives. And that, more than anything else, was what mattered. By the time Naomi returned to the office later that day, she felt a sense of renewal. The fatigue was still there, but it wasn't as crushing as before. She was ready to face whatever came next, but this time with a new perspective. She walked into the conference room for a meeting with her board, a renewed sense of purpose in her step. The room quieted as she entered, and for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt a sense of calm. There was still a long road ahead, still a fight to be had, but Naomi Carter was no longer running on empty. She had rediscovered the strength that had driven her from the beginning. Her team was counting on her, and she wasn't about to let them, or herself, down. "Let's get to work," Naomi said, her voice steady and confident. And as the meeting began, Naomi Carter realized that the real fight wasn't just about winning. It was about staying true to herself, about continuing to rise, and about remembering that the journey was just as important as the destination. The unseen battle. Naomi stood at the podium, looking out over the packed auditorium of one of the biggest tech conferences in the country. The stage lights were bright, casting a warm glow on her as she prepared to speak. Her mind was sharp, her focus clear, but there was a nagging feeling in her chest that wouldn't go away. It was the same feeling she'd had for the past few months. The realization that no matter how much she achieved, no matter how many barriers she shattered, the world still had a way of making her feel like she didn't belong. It was a familiar feeling now, a quiet hum at the back of her mind, a constant reminder that as a black woman at the top of the tech world, she was always fighting for something more than success. She was fighting for recognition. She was fighting to be seen, not just for her accomplishments, but for who she was, who she had always been. Not the token, diverse founder or the inspiring story, but a person with a vision, a businesswoman, a leader. Naomi adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the polished wood of the podium. This was her moment. This was the moment where she could speak directly to the people who needed to hear her voice the most. The next generation of entrepreneurs, innovators, and dreamers. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "I'm Naomi Carter, and I'm here today to talk about more than just business. I'm here to talk about resilience, about what it takes to stand up when the world tells you to sit down, when the world tells you you're too much, too bold, too ambitious for the spaces you're trying to occupy." The crowd was quiet, listening intently. Naomi could see the faces in the audience, some young, others older, some eager, others uncertain. Many of them, she knew, had come to hear her story, not just the story of a successful entrepreneur, but the story of the woman behind the company. The woman who had fought through the same doubts, the same biases, the same hurdles that they too had faced. "I grew up in a neighborhood where success wasn't just a goal, it was a dream, something far out of reach," Naomi continued, her voice growing stronger. "The world didn't see me. They saw a black girl from a working-class family in Birmingham, Alabama. They saw a girl who was never supposed to make it. But I didn't just want to make it. I wanted to build something that could change the world. Something that could prove that no matter where you come from, no matter the color of your skin or the size of your bank account, you have the power to make a difference." Her words were met with a few nods, some murmurs of agreement. Naomi could feel the energy in the room shift, and for the first time in months, she felt like she was truly speaking to people who understood her, who understood what it was like to fight for a seat at the table, and then have that seat questioned the moment you sat down. "But the thing is," Naomi paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, "even when you're successful, even when you've achieved everything you set out to do, you'll face challenges. You'll be tested in ways you never expected. I've had doors slammed in my face, been doubted by people who couldn't see past my skin. I've been asked questions like, 'How did you make this happen?' As if my success were a fluke, something out of my control. I've been pulled over by the police, humiliated for no other reason than the fact that I'm a black woman driving a nice car in a neighborhood where I supposedly didn't belong." A murmur of shock rippled through the audience, but Naomi didn't pause. She had said this story before, but never in such a public space, never with so many eyes on her. She felt the weight of it, but also the power. This was the truth. This was part of her journey. And it was a journey that could not be ignored. "That night, when the police stopped me, I was so calm," Naomi continued, her voice steady. "But inside, I was furious. Not just for myself, but for every black woman, every person of color who has ever had to endure the indignity of being treated as less than. I was furious because I knew that, despite everything I had built, despite everything I had worked for, I was still seen as a threat, still seen as a person who didn't belong. But I stood my ground. I didn't back down. And I didn't let them win. Because I knew that the world wasn't going to hand me anything. If I wanted respect, if I wanted to make a difference, I had to demand it." She paused again, letting her words sink in. The room was quiet now, all eyes on her, as though they were waiting for her next move. "The thing is," she said, her voice dropping to a softer, more reflective tone, "I know I'm not the only one who's been through this. I know I'm not the only one who's faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. But here's the truth. The biggest battle we face is the battle within ourselves. It's the battle to stay true to who we are when the world keeps trying to tell us we're not enough. When the world keeps trying to make us believe that our success is somehow undeserved." Naomi's eyes scanned the room, her gaze locking with several faces, young men and women who were just starting out, and older professionals who had been through their own struggles. She saw in their eyes something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. Not the hope that everything would be easy, but the hope that no matter how difficult it got, they could keep going. "I'm here to tell you that you are enough," Naomi said, her voice strong now, filled with conviction. "You don't need anyone's permission to succeed. You don't need anyone to validate your worth. You are worthy of every opportunity that comes your way. And yes, it's going to be hard. It's going to feel like the world is constantly pushing back against you. But every time they try to pull you down, you stand up taller. Every time they tell you no, you find a way to say yes. You don't just survive, you thrive. The room was silent for a moment before the applause started. At first, it was hesitant, but then it grew louder, more passionate. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat, but she held back the tears. This wasn't just applause for her. It was for every person who had ever been doubted, every person who had been made to feel small, every person who had been told they couldn't succeed. As the applause died down, Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She had done what she had set out to do, not just to inspire, but to make people believe in themselves, to remind them that no matter how tough the road got, they could always rise. That evening, after the conference, Naomi stood outside the venue, taking in the cool night air. The world felt different now, quieter, almost. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was constantly fighting for recognition. She had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her own power. As she made her way to the car, she received a text from her brother Ethan. "You did it, Naomi. I'm proud of you. Don't ever forget who you are." The words hit her harder than she expected. Ethan had been her rock throughout this journey, and though they had been through their own struggles growing up, he had always been there to remind her of her worth. She could hear his voice in her head as she read the message. "Don't ever forget who you are." She smiled, feeling the warmth spread through her. Naomi had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself to the world. But tonight, she had remembered something important. She didn't need to prove anything. She was already enough. As she drove through the quiet streets of Birmingham, Naomi Carter thought about the future. The road ahead would still be difficult, still filled with challenges, but she wasn't afraid. Because now, she knew the most important thing of all. She didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. She had already claimed her place in the world, and no one could take that away from her. She had won the unseen battle, the one for her own self-worth. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest victory of all.